But we've also been watching Wim Wenders' epic film Until the End of the World. And we just saw Jean Moreau's death scene where she says to Max von Sydow, sometimes the greatest happiness happens in the worst of times. These are the worst of times, but you've all come through brilliantly, actually. I've been reading your theses over the last weeks in isolation, and I have to say they comprise a remarkable range of subjects, even for us, from a particular insight into how a piece of the California utopian imagination turned dystopian, to the Yoruba imagination and cosmology, with a sense of a fable that unfolds into criticism, and from an analysis of how, as we enter further into a world dominated by digital corporations, there's a need for a conversation about what our digital rights are, to the hidden meanings of the man of signs in the old farmer's almanac and planting by the moon, and from the acoustics of solitude and the sacred space of sound to the homeless body of art, to a deep dive into the corporeal experience of Albert Pinkham writer's paintings. I want to thank your tireless and patient thesis seminar leader, Jennifer Krasinski, and each of your extraordinary thesis advisors. And I think we're all here, yeah, who gave so much in these perilous times. Nancy Princenthal, Dan Lukic, Thomas Beard, Chuck Stein, and Jen Cabot. And thank you to Annette Warehon, who keeps it all together somehow still. And I want to thank you all. You got dealt a very tough hand this year, especially in the last few months. And you all came through anyway. So thank you and congratulations. Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. For those of you I've never met before, my name is Jennifer Krasinski, and I'm on faculty at the MFA Art Writing Department. And I worked with the writers we're celebrating tonight, Loon, Angela, Ernest, Will, Yinka, and Ben. I worked with them for the entire school year, first in writing 3 in this past autumn, and then in the thesis workshop this spring. And I love teaching these 2 semesters back to back because I get to see firsthand how each student develops and refines their craft, their voice, and their ideas to become, as they all have, the dedicated writers and imaginative thinkers that they were always meant to be. So it's a pleasure also to welcome you all tonight. And I just want to take a moment to say to you students, Loon, Angela, Ernest, Will, Yinka, and Ben, that it is my extremely biased, but also very humble opinion that you are all distinctly marvelous, and as such have chosen a distinctly marvelous path, a writer's life, or at least a life with writing. And I can promise you this about that. As a writer, you will never be bored. You will always be kept on your toes. You will be forever challenged to channel new ideas, especially now in this new world that's upon us. And by sharing your minds and your stories with others, you will find yourselves in conversation with the minds and stories of others. Embrace that connection, that role, and allow your curiosity, your compassion, your intellect, and your passions to be your guides. You will never regret a moment of this life if you do exactly that. So that's all to say congratulations. You did it, and you did it mightily. I'm really proud of all of you, and I'm thrilled to celebrate with you tonight, and I can't wait to read more from all of you in the future. And before we begin, I just wanted to say a few practical notes for our guests. First of all, please make sure you're on mute. We're trying to do a good job of that, but just in case, I'll ask you to do that. Secondly, our readers are going to be presenting images as they speak, and the best way to see both the reader and the image at the same time is to choose the speaker view option, which is up in your, I guess it would be this way, upper right-hand corner. And then choose the side-by-side option, which is going to come up. It'll appear at the top center of your screen once the reader has begun their presentation. And if you're having any problems at all, I am no Zoom expert, neither is my colleague Annette, but give us a chat in the chat box and see if we can't help you. I also want to let you know that at the end of the reading, we're going to be opening up this virtual floor for a Q&A. So at that point, I'm going to encourage you all to send any questions, again, via the chat box, and I'll relay those questions to the appropriate reader. Now, I know that you're all on mute, and which means that none of our readers will hear your wondrous applause, but they can see you. So just a last note that I want to encourage you all to still applaud and cheer or acknowledge the job beautifully done with any demonstrative gestures of support and congratulations that you can think of, because I know they deserve it and I know that they will appreciate it. So once again, thank you all for joining us, and please now welcome our very first reader of the evening, Loon. Loon, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? You can hear me? We're good? Yes. Hopefully. Okay, wonderful. So I've written about an image called The Man of Signs, which I first learned about from my grandmother. And so in my thesis, my 3 chapters trace the use of this image in my family and across history. So my thesis is titled Until the Moon is Below the Knees, and I'll be reading from the introduction. On May 9th, 2017, I began writing down my grandmother's stories. My iPhone note describes how she once watched a small globe of light roll into her childhood home in rural Cato, Indiana. In the summer heat, her parents often left the white farmhouse doors open. On this stormy day, a mysterious orb rolled through the side door, paused, then rolled out the way it came. Some doubt the existence of this luminous phenomenon called ball lightning. Science still can't explain it, but centuries of literature and lore provide accounts. That's what draws me to stories. They don't have to offer proof or reason. They mimic life in the way that there aren't always answers, just encounters. I typed this ball lightning story on the same day as the funeral for my mother's father, whom we called Papa. He was my first grandparent to die. His death was painful for me, but also generous. Loss reacquainted me with temporality, showing me its fondness. My relationship with time shifted. I was a luminous orb who rolled in for just a moment. As I talked with my grandmother, whom I call Grandmom, I hoped to connect dots to see how this led to that. But lineage is not so linear. I had to learn the art of the question. I'd ask Grandmom about something as if I was gathering research, which I was, but she responded with answers, not stories. It felt clunky. Honoring our relationship became the key. When I talked with her as a curious granddaughter, not a writer, the conversation yielded rich recollections without fail. I stopped having to ask her anything. Stories made their way to me. Some had already been with me for years. In Cato, a half a mile down a gravel road near the persimmon tree, a driveway still leads to the 100 acres where my grandmother grew up. She inherited it, and my family still visits each year. As a young girl, I loved playing on the concrete stoops of her childhood home, but the white farmhouse is gone. The stairs no longer lead inside. They only demarcate what was once the perimeter. Back then, I ran up each step and jumped off onto the mowed grass, imagining that I landed in another era. My grandmother burned down the house before I was born. No one lived there for a decade once her aging parents, Darvin and Bessie, moved to the nearby town of Petersburg. By the time they died and left it to her, the house's dilapidated condition brought my grandmother shame, so she lit it on fire. I think of it as a burnt offering for her parents then and now, somehow, for me. The same month that I began writing down my grandmother's stories, my husband and I found an apartment in Montclair, New Jersey. This place became my 18th home. The house numbers hanging on the paint-chipped porch read 18. I still appreciate the synchronicity. We'd already lived in New Jersey for 4 years, but no matter where I lived, I wondered about living somewhere else. But I didn't know where else was. I was used to moving. I grew up in Noblesville, an Indianapolis suburb over 3 hours north of Cato. And after my parents divorced when I was 8 years old, I moved nearly every year until I left for college, 10 times. Rent increases suck for a single mother of 2. The summer before I left for college, my mom lost her job in the recession. She couldn't afford to pay rent, so we moved in with her friend from church. I slept in the office. After leaving for college in Tennessee, I swore I'd never live in Indiana again. No matter where I went, though, the Hoosier in me tagged along. The longer I lived elsewhere, in Appalachia and now in the Northeast, the more I noticed Indiana's impressions on me. The quietude of my mind looks like golden waves of lightning bugs flickering across pink-tinted cornfields at dusk. There I retreated then, and now in my imagination still. My grandmother's stories helped me grapple with this inner landscape. In Cato, Indiana, where there is no longer a house, I began to make sense of home. Despite growing up surrounded by cornfields, I know so little about the crop, except that I'm allergic. I found out when I was 16, and I thought of it as being allergic to home, the Corn Belt, which only affirmed my desire to leave the region. It rejected me first. Learning about my allergy was the first time I considered what constituted processed and genetically modified foods, and what the implications were for added hormones, pesticides, and fertilizers. What did it mean for my body to reject the ecosystem in which it lives? My gut understood, but my mind had to catch up. After moving away, I realized that my desire to leave was less about the place itself and more about my relationship to the place, a dynamic that began long before I came along. The name for corn was born out of its colonization. Potawatomi ecologist and writer Robin Wall Kimmerer maps its history in her essay, Corn Tastes Better on the Honor System. Drawing from thousands of years of careful cultivation, its indigenous names mean bringer of life, wife of the sun, our daily bread, mother of all things. Nourishment was symbiotic for plant and human. For English settlers, corn was a general term used for any grain. The word described no plant in particular. It generalized. These distinctions in language are manifest in its seeds today. Kimmerer compares her many-colored seeds that she can save and replant with her neighbor's gold GMO variety that he must rebuy every year. Nonetheless, she says, when the seeds are in the ground and the gentle spring rain starts to fall, I suspect he looks up at the sky and prays. Either by hand or machine, planting is still an act of faith. In reading Kimmerer, I thought about my great-grandparents farming on the cusp of agriculture's industrialization. What informed their way of life? It wasn't until November 2018 that my grandmother told me about the sign of the moon. My great-grandparents farmed, gardened, raised livestock, and even weaned their children in accordance with the lunar phases and celestial position. Daily life was oriented around this custom that is older than the written word. As my grandmother tells it, only the women preserve this age-old practice by referring to the old Farmer's Almanac. The lore lives on in her stories. Why hadn't I heard of this way of life before? For my whole life, I visited the farm, but now this unfamiliar language about the sign of the moon cracked open histories unknown to me. Though my grandparents do not live on the farm, they lease more than half of the acreage to farmers and let the rest grow as forests and meadows. When I was a child, my family drove 3.5 hours away from manicured lawns and parks to sleep in the 2 camper trailers that we parked there. On the farm, even the adults played. By then, my grandparents acquired a few hundred additional acres, expanding from 100 to 475. Depending on the season, we fished for bluegill or bass from a handful of ponds and foraged morel mushrooms in the woods or American persimmons along the forest edges. We rode four-wheelers and dirt bikes through fields of corn and soybeans in between the rows so as to not ruin the crops, and only while the corn was short enough. As the ATV tires smashed the wild onion in the early summer, the wind carried its sweet, grassy aroma. It felt like a second home, but it was different than when my grandmother grew up. New customs were emerging. I was too young to realize that life on the farm was being created as we lived. In early 2019, my grandmother recalled more and more memories about this daily lunar rhythm. The sign of the moon, she kept saying. I wondered if industrial farmers practiced lunar planting. Despite growing up in the Corn Belt, I realized I didn't know the first thing about farming or even gardening. Given that my great-grandparents survived this way, I wondered why this knowledge wasn't passed down in my family. Why did these customs seem to lose value with the next generations? By spring, I bought the old Farmer's Almanac. I didn't have a use for it, but I had to start somewhere. I thumbed through calendar tables, articles on astronomy and agriculture, and weather predictions. Near the back in the astrology section, I noticed a figure called the Man of Signs. next to a table about gardening by the moon. This anatomical body, also known as a zodiac man or Homo signorum, looks like a woodcut medical illustration with its guts exposed. But rather than highlighting muscles or bones or organs, the man of science depicts the regions of the body that correspond to the zodiac. It lists 12 body parts from head to toe: Aries, the head; Taurus, the neck; Gemini, the arms; Cancer, the breast; Leo, the heart; Virgo, the belly; Libra, the reins; Scorpio, the secrets; Sagittarius, the thighs; Capricorn, the knees; Aquarius, the legs; and Pisces, the feet. Whenever the moon is in, say, Leo, the heart is affected. This must be what my grandmother meant by the sign of the moon. It's a zodiac sign. Grandma once told me about the advice to wait to pull teeth until the moon is below the knees. Still, I struggle to conceptualize how the image functions, but it portrays a worldview where the body, too, is tethered to the land and cosmos. For millennia, the zodiac has oriented agriculture and medicine as a means of survival. But what did this look like in practice? I read about how each sign corresponds to herbs and animals, specific to certain ailments, seasons, and regions of the body. The man of signs is a storage bank, embodied memory. I wondered how my own body houses memory. My great-grandmother, Bessie, practiced lunar planting, but my grandmother chose not to. Like the white farmhouse, this practice almost turned to ash too. Does my family even have any food customs on the farm nowadays, I wondered. The only one that remains is foraging. My favorite is gathering persimmons. As I follow their tracks, they help me trace my ancestral relationship to the land. The soil remembers its histories in ways that family stories might gloss over. Different modes of time have impressed upon it. After eating persimmons from the farm for decades, I begin to digest these layers. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Angela Davignon. I'm going next, in case anyone needs to put me in the right spot. My thesis is called The Last Resort on Land Use, Locals, and Beach Biennales. It focuses on a small retirement community in the desert named Bombay Beach, which sits on the shore of California's largest body of water, which is also an ecological disaster site called the Salton Sea. In the last few years, it's become the setting for a Burning Man-style art festival called the Bombay Beach Biennale, helmed by very wealthy Angelenos who are drawn to the area's ruin-like landscape. So the excerpt I'm going to read for you compares footage of Bombay Beach from a local public access television show and then a scene from Wim Wenders' film Wings of Desire. One moment. The image that I'm showing you here is the public access footage, and then on the other side is the screenshot from Wim Wenders' Wings of Desire. On the shores of Bombay Beach sits the Ski Inn, a roadside bar whose interior is covered in pen-marked dollar bills from floor to ceiling. A hot pink handwritten sign on the door reads, "Stuck in the sand with a number to call." The shop-worn narratives of art washing and gentrification don't easily apply to a place like Bombay Beach. This planned community was built for outsiders and weekend tourism, for people looking to get lost and not be found, to visit and end up staying for longer than they meant to, or for strangers to sit at the beach and drink and then drive on. I was one of the latter when I arrived at the Ski Inn. The crowd was older, save for the youngish bartenders. Everyone was California friendly. They offered each other shots more than once, at 3 p.m. no less, and held conversations about methadone and a friend who recently lost their driver's license. A variety of kitschy signage with snarky adages hung behind the bar. For example, if assholes could fly, we'd be a damn airport. Cheap beer in the signature dish, a plate of street-style fish tacos that Anthony Bourdain once raved about was listed for $5, no tax. I stuck with $3 Bud Light. A silver-haired biker, a Willie Nelson type with half the affability, ordered a gin and interrogated the 20-something bartender about the safety of his motorcycle parked out front. "Everyone here is real friendly," she said. "No one's going to touch your bike," she added. "No one wants to." On the bar sits a plastic beer pitcher holding a bouquet of rainbow roses, the kind made with food dye and sold at stands off the highway. The roses are about as natural as Bombay Beach, but no less pretty. I settled up and trudged through the cold mud to the beach. The sun was about to set and the water was misty, shimmering with toxins. 3 men pedaled LED-lit unicycles, blasting house music and dancing with arms waving in the air as they zoomed along the salt-encrusted shore. A bunch of youngish-looking adults were drinking 40s, leaning against their hydraulically lifted truck. A woman being photographed near a big middle star hiked up her skirt while a man triple her size snapped shot after shot. It struck me then. This is a silly place to vacation if one has the means to go someplace better, but it's absolute paradise if this is the only beach you know. A stark obverse difference between the crowd at Ski Inn and the handful of people out on the beach marks the distance it takes to walk from the bar to the beach. Generational differences, sure, but tonal distinctions too. Here, a crew of arty 30-somethings would sooner embrace the melancholic post-resort feeling of the toxic shore, while another set, much older, stayed inside, pulling the blinds shut while the sun set behind their backs. Quote, "With no intervention, the desert will eventually reclaim the sea. It is said that when this happens, there will be alkaline dust storms that will leave the region uninhabitable," end quote, writes an anonymous archivist for the art environment conservation organization Spaces. The dust from the Salton Sea would eventually blow into adjacent low-income agricultural communities where respiratory illnesses are already on the rise, especially in children. Anticipating this eventual dust bowl, and in light of a fresh decade of neglect, in October 2019, Imperial County declared a state of emergency for the entirety of the Salton Sea. Quote, "The world seems to be sinking into dust," end quote, thinks the character of Homer, an aging poet, in Wim Wenders' film Wings of Desire, in which angels listen to the thoughts of downtrodden Germans in post-war Berlin. In one scene, Homer wanders through an open and overgrown field like a spool unraveling downhill. An unseen angel dressed in all black follows beside him while listening to his thoughts. Homer treads a mental map of empty space, looking for Potsdamer Platz, a public square where daily life and traffic surged before it was demolished by war bombs. As he searches in confusion, Homer describes the cafe where he drank coffee, the cigar shop where he smoked with friends. He points to the air above him, indicating towers that no longer exist. Finally, Homer finds an easy chair in the middle of the tall grass and sits, exhausted by time and memory. "I won't give up as long as I haven't found the Potsdamer Platz," he says, and so he sleeps, because he won't. In many photographic and filmic images, Bombay Beach plays an ephemeral and elemental force that, like Homer's Lost Berlin, absorbs its nominal subject. Often it plays itself. On screen, the low desert landscape is a blank plain, like a screen. Like the white roses injected with food dyes on the bar counter, it takes on the colors cast onto its pale salt surface. But mostly and continuously, Bombay Beach is a metaphor for California's failure, the folly of its stubborn conviction that it is a utopia even as it floods and sinks and crumbles. Quote, "America is a giant hologram, in the sense that information concerning the whole is contained in each of its elements," wrote Baudrillard. "Take the tiniest place in the desert, any old street in a Midwest town, a parking lot, a Californian house, a Burger King or a Studebaker, and you have the whole of the US, south, north, east, or west. By that measure, all of America happens at the Ski Inn. The Salton Sea is America's rotted Riviera. The motorcycle no one wanted to steal holds the engine heart of the nation. If America is a collection of semiotic objects, as Baudrillard says, a series of finished fetish holograms, then Bombay Beach is the cosmic empty hand. All that defined it fell from its fingers like sand. Its avenues are the lines in its palms that spell out its speculative future. The lifeline is long but broken." The lighting just changed, wow. "In most writing and films made about Bombay Beach, a longtime resident nicknamed Wacko regularly appears. I watch him age on screen. First in a 1999 episode of Visiting with Huell Hauser, a public television travel show in which the host, the inimitable Huell Hauser, a friendly Southern man with deep dimples and the body of a linebacker, visits and interviews people in the furthest corners of the state of California. In the episode of Visiting, and as Hauser meets the townsfolk, Wacko is present in almost every shot, hovering behind Hauser throughout the episode, stepping in and out of frame in a bright yellow windbreaker, like a tropical gargoyle. In the Visiting with Huell Hauser footage, Wacko next takes Hauser on his own tour of the places he used to love. This used to be our favorite bar for 35 years, he says, as he pauses next to a one-story, tumble-down shack, abandoned and rattled by wind, with an old neon sign reading, "Trade winds, cocktails, exclamation point." Even the wood in the boarded-up windows is rotted and worn. Mud stains indicate past flooding, which has peeled 3 feet of stucco off the facade. Over and over, Wacko points like a disappointed pioneer, waving his hand in the air to indicate a crowd that no longer arrives. In a final scene with a continuous tracking shot, Hauser and Wacko unite with Steve Horvitz, the park ranger at the Marina and RV Park. Hauser's voice fills with wonder as he points to partially submerged, salt-encrusted buildings. "This looks surreal," says Hauser, while Horvitz describes the many movies that have been filmed in the area. Wacko hangs back until Hauser and his cameraman pause on a particularly devastated plot filled 6 feet deep with algae green water. "It makes for a wonderful Hollywood movie set," says the park ranger. Wacko moves slowly into the shot and mumbles out of range of the microphone. "Sir?" asks Hauser. Wacko repeats himself, leaning into the microphone with hands shoved in his pockets. "This used to be my plot, and that's where my girlfriend got burned up in a fire, and my bar was right there on that corner." It's a moment that stuns. Wacko's own map, like Homer's in Wings of Desire, is seared into his memory by trauma. He's still looking for Bombay Beach as Homer looks for Potsdam or plots. Or maybe it's that he can't stop finding it every day that he lives there in the shadow of time. Climate change and neglect exacerbates the conditions that affect the Salton Sea, but it was a fragile landscape from the start. The founding flood of 1905, when the Colorado River overflowed into the Salton Sea, created a disaster for homesteaders and farmers. One archival image from the aftermath of the Great Flood of 1905, labeled the 1906 rise of the Salton Sea, mirrors the low-fi VHS footage of Wacko's home in the Visiting episode, water up to the windows and a pocket of dead pond with the pitched roof angling to the sky. In the black and white image, women in long skirts and tall boots stand proudly on the roofs of their bungalows as if to say, "This is what we have left, and it's still ours." Wacko continues to live on the shore of his own loss, near the corner where his favorite bar used to be. It's easier to dig in your heels when the ground is made of silt and mud. Thank you.
Okay. Let me see. Okay. Hi. I'm Ben Swift, and I'm going to be reading from my thesis. It's called "No Longer on This Planet," and it's about the painter Albert Pinkham Ryder. And that is, the title comes from something the artist Khalil Gibran said about Ryder when he visited him around 1916. And Ryder lived from about mid-19th century to right before World War I. And I'm kind of just gonna read a couple of vignettes and skip around, and I'll let other people who knew him kind of introduce him here. All right. In the early days, he wore all white with a sort of fez. He was a dandy, claimed Khalil Gibran. He had beautiful, friendly brown eyes, wrote the painter Albert Groll, like a Newfoundland dog. He was big, but not tall, said Rosalie Warner, sculptor Olin Warner's daughter. Like a bear, but not a tall bear. He was a poor old fellow with rheumy eyes, wrote Walter Kuhn, dirty and grimy, who wore highly polished shoes. He had shaggy eyebrows, said Marston Hartley, which were like lichens overhanging rocks of granite. His eyes, said James E. Kelly, were inclined to be blue and often had a frank, confiding look, like the eyes of a child. He looked like a farmer, said Ernest Lawson. He reminded Helena Decay of the Irish poet A.E., because both men were large and heavy and bearded, and there was something mysterious about both of them. The elbow of Ryder's coat was always worn, said Salvador Guarino, from dusting his pictures with his sleeve. I wish I could convey to you how the man looked, wrote Sadiki Hartman, but why attempt the futile task of putting physiognomy into words? He was a magnificent derelict, said the critic Paul Rosenfeld. I thought you were a bum, said one of the neighborhood kids who saw him in the paper. He looks like a tramp, said the attendant of the Montrose Gallery to Mr. Montrose, the gallery director. Shall I get him out? I think not, replied Mr. Montrose. That's one of the most distinguished national painters, Albert Pinkham Ryder. He made me ashamed, said Khalil Gibran, of being clean. And this image is actually a portrait by Marsden Hartley of Ryder, done around 1930, I think, so a little over a decade after he died from memory. This painting is called Marine. It's from about 1890. Three boats like the silhouettes of bent churches, their sails like angular black obelisks moving through the sea. The crew and cargo are nowhere in sight. Shadows, not content to fall from their objects, mingle in the shade where we can't see them. Above, the clouds are the color of night. The top of the sky seems lit by sickly fledgling stars, and its bottom to be painted a burnished gold by some unseen sun. Here vagueness itself seems sharp. Even curved lines seem angular. Heavy clouds, like the bows of tremendous ships, flee over the horizon. Areas of these paintings, wrote one critic, do not lie in life. It is like the earth, wrote another, but not the earth exactly. As if the wind here blew from some other planet. As if time here stretched out, compressed, moved with irregular steps, tripped over itself. Here everything is the same, only a little different. These paintings seem to take place a little beyond the border of the world, not far enough away to lose the sight of its shore, but distant enough so that these boats, if they tried to return, would have trouble getting back. This painting is called Jonah, and it's a very kind of, in some ways, typical Ryder painting that takes a story from the Bible or romantic poetry and explodes it a little bit. And it's typical too because it balances a little bit between the kind of sublime and the absurd. Anyway, the sea is boiling. The waves are at cross purposes, as if every direction met and were trying to overpower the others. Nothing is level, everything shifts. The depths rise and the surface falls, and up and down confuse themselves for one another. The cracks in the surface look like broken spider webs, and like them are faint and can only be seen up close from an oblique angle, but when they catch the light, like a crystal, all their facets sparkle. The boat bends as if it were a fish. The fish is steady as if it were a boat. It stares with a strange indifference, as if it had seen this many times before. Above them, the countenance of an old-fashioned creator looks on, cradling his little world. The canvas is not large, perhaps 27 or 34 inches, but carries such imaginative power as to overwhelm, wrote the artist Harris S. Morris, who along with several companions accompanied Ryder to see the painting displayed. The picture made a hush, he said. Nobody wanted to speak. They stood staring at it in silence for a long time, until Ryder's voice suddenly broke the spell. I say, Morris, he said, how do you like God? And then this painting's called The Racetrack, and some people may know it. I'm just going to give a little background on it because it has an interesting story behind it, which is a friend of Ryder's wagered essentially all his money on a horse, and Ryder had advised him not to, and he did it, and he found out about it, and he rushed to go find him, and it turned out his friend had actually killed himself. So it's a horrible story, but under the sign of that event, this painting was made. So I'm going to read a little bit about that too. In the painting, we don't know whether it's night or day. The moon, tangled in the twine of shadows, struggles to rise. The sun, held down by the weight of a darkened cloud, has taken up residence in another sky. The clouds are the texture and color of a stone statue worn by the hands of pilgrims until all its detail has come off in their fingers. The dark blue behind the clouds looks as if it weren't the sky, but a thick dark cloth separating us from the sky. The racetrack is a circle, like the face of a giant clock. Death rides a horse, he is thin, like one of the dead from a painting by Bruegel. A snake looks on in the foreground. The white horse, like the one Ryder had as a child, is frozen in mid-gallop, outside physical law. Humans race counterclockwise, but death races in the same direction as the clock. And I'm just going to read one more really quick. Actually, I'll full screen this back to Ryder. And this last one is just a kind of compendium of kind of myths about Ryder. Some of them, most of them being true. That he kept a stew pot boiling at all times and would add many different types of grain, meat, and fruit in a perpetually boiling ferment from which he would periodically eat when the mood struck him. That he baked his canvases in the oven sometimes. That he loved oysters. That he would get drunk occasionally and sing old songs from the sea. That he never learned how to cash a check. That he liked to talk philosophy and poetry, but only with the elderly lady who ran the newsstand. That he had a high-pitched, squeaky voice like a mouse and an otherworldly laugh. That he had almost no friends and was a recluse. That he had many friends and was sometimes present at the most fashionable salons. That he had the most unusual poem Sadakichi Hartman ever read. That he had once proposed to a woman he had never seen because he fell in love with the sound of her violin playing, which he could hear dampened through the walls. That he was once in love with a not very talented opera singer. That he took 3 trips to Europe, but did so mostly for the long sea voyages there and back, and would stay up all night lying out on the deck, looking at the dark sea. That his work was mostly collected by sea captains. That he once exclaimed to the painter Paul Doherty that he found the most beautiful thing you ever saw, and that it was a toothpaste advertisement. That the face of the whale in the painting Jonah came from a stuffed fish he kept in his studio. That in the hallway leading to his studio, there was a gaudy lamp, a mess of wires over-adorned with cheap pink beads, and whenever he passed it, bathed in its dull pink glow, he would murmur to himself, "How pretty." That he might be seen at any hour on any street in New York, standing still, his head angled up, looking up at the stars. That his ghost returned after he died to guide his friend Louise Fitzpatrick's hand in finishing some of his paintings, and in this manner, many of his masterpieces were either completed or compromised, depending on one's perspective and whether one believes in ghosts. Thank you.
Hi, so I believe I'm next. My name is William Whitney. My thesis is titled Removed with No Warning, an examination of image censorship on social media platforms and the gray area in between. In figuring out my thesis, I tried to think about how powerful images can really be, and then think about where we are in terms of our continuance reliance on social media, especially in Corona season, and how we're kind of in bed with these corporations and where that leaves us as a society. Let me share my screen. The most political decision you make is where you direct people's eyes. Wim Wenders, The Act of Seeing. The first image I can fully remember is of the terrorist attack on September 11, 2001. I was 6 years old when the planes hit the World Trade Center's Twin Towers, in a first grade classroom in downtown Manhattan, unable to fully process what had just occurred. I heard the whispers from adult to adult about planes hitting the World Trade Center and how parents were coming to school to pick up their children. I remember how each time a new person was informed, they seemed to freeze up for a moment, as if the information would not properly register. Most of all, though, what I think about when I reflect upon that moment in time is the exact moment the attack became real to me. This was not in the school classroom, where they had instructed us to play with toys until our parents arrived to pick us up, nor was it on the hurried walk home back to our apartment with my father as he tried to contact my mother, who worked near the towers, to no avail. The attack became real to me when I saw the image of the plane hitting the first tower on the television at home. Every channel was discussing what had happened, regardless of if it was normally a news channel or not. My reaction was one of disbelief and utter confusion. I did not know much about planes at the time, and truthfully, I was not clear on what an attack on those two buildings in particular meant to the global audience witnessing the attack occur. All I knew for sure was that planes were not supposed to hit buildings. I remember the moment the image of the attack seared itself into my memory. It was the image itself, rather than any description of event, that conveyed to me the seriousness of the situation. The rest of the day is a blur amidst waves of fear and uncertainty about the world, about where my mother was, about when or if she would get home. I would wind up being extremely fortunate, as she did later in the day. That day was extremely tragic, but I bring it up in this instance because it is the event most responsible for my fundamental belief in the importance of images to be shared freely. Images possess a scarce form of raw power, able to elicit reactions and responses, to command everything from sexual arousal to disgust. In art historian David Friedberg's 1957 book, The Power of Images, he discusses how images have been viewed as a source of influence dating back centuries. In Italy, from the 14th century to the 17th century, brotherhoods would present small painted images to condemned prisoners as a means of consolation the night before their execution. The following day, the image would be brought along to the execution and held before the prisoner up until it was clear that he was no longer living. There's a magical effect that images can have on humans. At the current moment, the popularity of social media has led to a proliferation of shared images, further increasing their importance as contributors to the perceptions of ongoing events in the world around us. Social media usage continues to rise each year, with the number of users estimated to increase from 2.82 billion to 3.9 billion by 2021, thereby making discussion about what social media content is allowed online and what gets censored or hidden from the public extremely relevant by those who worry about the future of society in the digitized world. After years of a slow but steady decline in news circulation, social media is now viewed by some as an equally reliable news source. Per Pew Research Center, 1 in 5 US adults say they often get news via social media, slightly higher than the share who do so from print newspaper, which is around 16%. This is even more true amongst younger generations, as adults aged 18 to 29 in the United States are increasingly likely to receive their news from a social media platform. Given the influence social media has to shape our current society, it is crucial that users can share images and thoughts as they see fit. The images shared on these platforms often impact people's views of the world around them. Censorship of certain images does nothing except prevent experiences and stories from being shared. And this thesis will explore and provide context about this issue across 3 image and video sharing platforms: Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. So that was my introduction, and now I will read a section from the middle of my chapter on Facebook. Let me have a glass of water. Facebook has a long history of banning content, both images and pages. In August, the company settled a years-long lawsuit out of court with Frédéric Durand, a French school teacher who accused them of infringing on his freedom of expression in 2011. Durand's profile was removed for posting a link that included a thumbnail clip of an artwork depicting a nude woman's genitalia. Facebook viewed this as a violation of the company's policy at the time, which was a strict nudity ban. The nude image in question, however, was L'Origine du Monde, an oil painting by realist painter Gustave Courbet. It is widely regarded as a social treasure and on view in the Musée d'Orsay. Durand sued in French court and won. The verdict was later overturned by a higher court in March 2018, only for Durand to appeal the decision. This ultimately led to Facebook agreeing to make an unclosed donation to a French art association called Le Mur, ending Durand's lawsuit. Facebook undoubtedly had this incident in mind when it updated the platform's nudity policy to allow for artworks to portray it in 2015. And despite temporarily winning against Durand, the company agreed to recognize its mistake, foregoing another court date in lieu of a fiscal settlement. The handling of this lawsuit offers a glimpse into how social media companies view issues of censorship, as they were willing to not only delete the post, but Duran's account along with it. While this was a Facebook policy at the time, the policy itself was too strict, offering no maneuverability or foresight for moments such as Duran's post. It was updated in 2015, only for there to be another similar scandal in 2016, when Norwegian reporter Tom Effelhad had his account suspended over a post regarding photography that changed the history of warfare. In this instance, one of the photos posted was an iconic Vietnam War photo of Vietnamese children running away from a napalm attack. The children all have their mouths open in a scream, and the young girl in the middle is naked. It is a horrifying photo, one meant to show war in all its brutality, a destructive process full of death and innocent, terrified children. The image won a Pulitzer Prize in 1973 and is arguably the single most important image from the war, helping to change the public perception of the conflict. However, the photograph broke Facebook's community guidelines regarding nudity and child porn, leading to it being taken down. Norwegian newspaper Aftenposten noted Ekkelhad's removal over the photograph and proceeded to post it on their Facebook account. Their post was removed as well. These two removals were met with disbelief, and several Norwegian politicians, including Prime Minister Erna Solberg, quickly took to Facebook to post the image. Each of their posts were removed within hours, with Facebook sending each of them a message informing them that Facebook recognized the photograph's value, but that it would need to be pixelized in order to stay online due to the child nudity. Facebook's official statement on the matter read, "While we recognize that this photo is iconic, it's difficult to create a distinction between allowing a photograph of a nude child in one instance and not others." These actions prompted a global outcry. The Prime Minister posted the image again, defying Facebook's pixelation request, while Aftenposten editor-in-chief Espen Ego Hansen wrote Zuckerberg a front-page letter regarding the incident entitled "Dear Mark," in which he called Zuckerberg the world's most powerful editor, lauding Facebook's usefulness and ability to provide a meaningful platform, before questioning the platform's use of authoritarian tactics and rules. "Listen, Mark, this is serious," Hansen writes. "First, you create rules that don't distinguish between child porn and famous war photographs. Then you practice these rules without allowing space for good judgment. Finally, you even censor criticism against and a discussion about the decision, and you punish the person who dares to voice criticism." With the world watching, Facebook reversed its decision, and Justin Alfasky, a vice president in charge of media relations, published a post on Facebook describing the incident as a mistake, while highlighting the company's ability to listen to our community and improve. Yet Mark Zuckerberg remained silent once more, a decision made even more curious by the fact that it was a human moderator who flagged the content, rather than an artificial intelligence, which is reliant on the algorithm. These moments reveal a lot about Facebook as a business, as the company continues to maintain that it is a platform, thereby not being liable for the content that users share, while at the same time being a global entity trying to keep its marketability intact to continue to attract new users. It is a difficult position to keep, as trying to appeal to everyone sometimes results in appealing to no one. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ernest Arthur Bryan III, the last physician of images. I'll be showing images curated for this public reading on a few sections from my thesis text work entitled Nature, Molestation, Conservation, and Homelessness, New Terms to Describe Elusive Phenomena in Art. Within this text work, I create new terms redefine the aforementioned terms, use them to describe elusive phenomena in life and art, and then subject those phenomena to criticism. This text work is a work of criticism. A prerequisite for criticism is description. An articulate description provides a beautiful gaping hole. This hole is the path to criticism. It makes elusive phenomena present in a form that may bear its full oppression. This text work is ongoing. Comments and criticisms may be left in the margins of the most recent edition that can be accessed by scanning the QR code below. You can scan this code with your cell phone. If you open your phone as if you're taking a photograph, point it at the QR code, and use your finger and tap the square that appears around the QR code, and it will take you to the most recent edition of my thesis text work, and you can make comments or criticisms or read. The following is a fragment from the introduction. Nature, the generic term for the natural world, exists in flux between two poles, molested and unmolested. Molested nature is nature domesticated by humans and used in the service of humanity. Unmolested nature is an exceeding term, by which I mean it exceeds the parameters of its definition insofar as the force of its application and trajectory both determine and push beyond those parameters. Nature consumes itself to reproduce itself. Unmolested nature consumes most voraciously, but would never be considered a glutton. It is not dishonest. It is not immoral. The following is a fragment from a section titled, "What is Molestation?" It might help to think about molestation not as a kind of sexual perversion, but as an annoyance of the fundamental natural trajectory of things. For example, in the 4th century BCE, a dam was built in the city of Jawa to conserve water from a seasonally flooding river in contemporary Jordan. This dam allowed the Jawites to build a city and reproduce human life in the Black Desert for approximately 50 years. There could be no city without the dam, without the molestation of nature. Because in its unmolested state, the scorching desert and the flooding river are both inhospitable to human life. To build a dam is to interrupt and annoy the trajectory of a river. In other words, to build a dam is to molest a river, changing its state from unmolested nature to molested nature. Generally, molested nature is tolerable in the service of humans, as it conserves life, just as it did for the Jawites. And although the unseen force of unmolested nature originally produced humans, its unimpeded embrace consumes them. Molestation is not necessarily intimate, and yet it does somewhat mute the voice of nature's honest sensuality with cold, calculated hands. Those hands twist and warp material bodies, annoying nature's innate trajectory. That annoyance is essential for the conservation of human life, making all human life molested nature, because to molest nature is human nature. Here are some examples of the molestation of nature. The styling of the hair, the stretching of earlobes, facial scarification, modification of the shape and color of teeth, the elongation of the neck and body modification, binding of the feet, and the elongation of the skull. The following is a fragment from a section titled, the city on the mountain, and nature's awareness of its tradition. Tradition is the molestation enacted by society. It seizes upon the love produced through prolonged intercourse. What initiates of a given mode of being know of the treacherous summit of their work is that, although it is blissful in its volcanic heat and wondrous view, it is plagued. Contrary to what the uninitiated tourists and pedestrians think they know, for homeless artists and the real poor, in the city on the mountain, the experience of those artists and the abject life of the poor is the status quo. Poverty has become tradition, and it is a rich tradition. Trees know it. In this city on the mountain, the poor possess the most value. It is a secret to them, but not to stones. The value of the poor continues to increase. Regretfully, it is a value they cannot access. They lack the marketing means, real estate, and insured risk that would enable them to undertake procedures necessary to extract value from their own poverty. So they remain bonded to it. According to the stream that flows across stones, within the walls of this city, there is no safety. Its torturous abode imprisons citizens at the behest of power with a capital P. In this city, the prices of things are unknowable, and common folk are extorted by merchants and rentiers until only the wind shares their stories. The most coveted wife went to the market carrying a large purse of bills and coin to buy a chicken to feed her family. The shopkeeper said he wouldn't take her money, but they could barter. She had cultivated goods on the land from the microloan for the past 2 years. However, of everything she offered, he accepted nothing. Indigo, coffee, tobacco, he refused everything, but told her this. These days, the city is full of desire. You desire a chicken to feed your child, and I desire that secret which you willingly share with your husband. As she parted her full lips and white teeth set against umber skin, she replied, "You want that? When do you want it?" "I have it now. It'll only take a few minutes." She pulls the vibrator out of her purse, turns it on, and tosses it at him. "You mistake an empty cookpot for an empty purse in mind." She turns and walks out. Disgusted, she returned home, and in a voice that didn't match the arresting countenance of her beauty, she told her husband about the merchant's insult. Her husband, with a cool head and fiery eyes, stood up and went to the market carrying a larger purse of bills, coin, and his pistol. Arriving at the same shop, he entered and said, "I hear you're in search of secrets. I'll share with you that which you already know. Insulting a rich man is no secret to you, for you have insulted me through my wife, and my wife through me." He spat at the merchant's feet and left. Immediately, he found another merchant with fowl to sell. This one with a pockmarked face, he too refused money for the chicken, adding, "Now is the time for fulfilling desires. I could never have your wife through tryst or seduction, for only that which can be taken is taken. I am an honest merchant. All know that the marrow of my bone is transaction. Now, are you aware of the value of this chicken?" Holding its feet between his bony fingers, he scratched his ass with his left hand and said, "Why should you have your desire when I can't have mine? Your family will starve." The husband spat at the merchant's feet, and with his right hand consoling the pistol in his shoulder bag, he silently walked out. Returning home dyspeptic, he told his wife, "Beloved, don't worry yourself about the merchant's insult. The merchants, they conspire against us. I'll return with meat." He set out with an even larger purse of bills and coin, still keeping his pistol in his shoulder bag. Having descended the mountain, he was gone all day, only returning just before dusk. As he approached the courtyard to their property, the final rays from the sun lit up his bare, sweat-covered chest and face with warm gold. Over his broad shoulders was a healthy young goat, and in his arms were two small chickens to prepare for the family. Crossing the threshold, just as the sun was swallowed by the horizon, he saw his wife cooking a chicken, its tawny feet dangling out of the cook pot. Sadly, their eyes met. Although the psychic material forge stood over does not daily produce, and even iron wears out in the hands of the obsessed, their fingertips blistered, legs trembling, and back aching in a way that makes your soul jealous to whine, the molestation imposed by the owners and merchants, even when masquerading in their rag couture, is hardly worth the price of exchange. What can be taken is taken. What can be molested is molested because of its value. What is produced is effectively seized and molested by society. The secret of the couple made into a product for transaction is molestation. The poor are continually cashed in rather than cashing in on poverty. Imagine this: if the poor were to extract the value from their poverty, then poverty itself would become worthless as arid land or land exhausted of its material wealth. And if poverty itself became worthless, those who benefit from it behind the mask of power would suffer a loss so significant that no reparation could return them to solvency. Thank you.
Yes, okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Yinka Edejoba, and I'll be reading from my thesis called Village Dialectics. I'll try to do a small introduction, just like a paragraph from the preface, so we get the sense of what village dialectics is about. Okay, so the form of this thesis is a fictional narrative that follows a character who used to be a prince, but is now stuck on a slave ship towards an unknown destination. This character, which I have termed a village dialectic, ruminates on the nature of images through tools he is familiar with, tools connected to the very earth he was stolen away from, such as Yoruba cosmology, iconography, and divinity. He contends with what he has been taught, combating an internal intellectual crisis, a struggle between what he has seen and what he can prove. I'll read portions of the first part, which is titled Sand. They have carried me, out from the land which was my own, into this giant boat, into this belly of darkness, run by men whose color is white, towards a journey whose end I do not know. And was it not my brothers, my blood, who handed me over to them? My blood, how have you betrayed me? Otherwise, I, son of Shango, I whose mouth is fire, I, descendant of thunder, how would they have put me in shackles? Yes, I questioned the ancestors. Yes, I asked for explanations from those who split the land. Yes, I wrestled against those who laid the foundations of the world. But is it not my duty as a prince, as one primed to lead his people, to understand the metaphysical tree my society was hewn out of? How is it a crime that I set my face against the deities, that I asked them for more light, after that provided me by the chief priest? Eshu, God of right and wrong and red and black, and all that is between, owner of multiple eyes in every argument. After my initiation into the Awu, after I gained access into the lady, I conversed with you deep into the night. And when the moon rose, Eshu, you whispered into my ears the need to put the divine to the test. And right in the middle of that night, I set my feet to flight. I walked into the lady without turning my back. I looked the shigidi in the face and plucked the sculpture from its sacred place. The next day there was rain, the kind that was last seen when men still had eyes on their knees. The great river overflowed her banks. Through the market square she went, through shrines, through homesteads, until she got to the entrance of the sacred forest, where she became quiet and began to rest. They say 12 men died that day. They say 16 women died that day. They say 3 scores of children died that day. And then the Awo converged to inquire from Ifa why such a calamity should befall the land. But on entering the lady, they thought there was no need to disturb the divine elements. The missing shigidi was enough explanation. This was the general consensus, although I believe it could as well have been a coincidence. After the meeting, I walked up to the chief priest and confessed to him that the shigidi was now in the palace, under my bed. As is the manner with men who believe what they have not examined, he held his chest in horror. Prince, what have you done? Do you not know that this is treason? You have desecrated the land. I told him it could not be the now homeless shigidi that was responsible for the rain, for the great river overflowing our banks, for the deaths of the townsmen and women and children. How could the shigidi, which succumbed so easily to displacement, have caused such a mishap? But the priest was adamant. A witch cried last night and a child died this morning. Who doesn't know that the witch is responsible for the death of the child? So they bound me, so they kept me, so they put me in the dungeon in the palace for days, awaiting the king's orders. There I sat counting the moons, scratching the earth with my fingers, and stuck in this dungeon, my judgment would normally be death, to be beheaded at the feet of Ogun. Ogun, the one who, having water at home, elects to bathe with blood. But no one offers the child of Ore to Ore. And when men hunt for today, what they catch is tomorrow. As a prince, I couldn't be offered to Ogun, otherwise my blood on the earth would provoke further calamities. Yet my crime was so great, the only recourse was exile. Not only was I to be exiled from the town, I was to be exiled across the seas to an unknown land. The Ogboni came in the night, holding their edon and chanting, all of them draped in white robes. I was escorted out of the palace towards the dungeon. The leader of the Ogboni handed me the edon as the journey proceeded, my final reception of respect, also a reminder of the sin I had supposedly committed. I could not help but study the edon one more time, the heaviness of the twin sculpture, the circular rings around the heads, the weight in the eyes, the chain linking their heads as if to say that their destiny was intrinsically linked. What was the male figure holding? Why was the female figure clutching her breasts? Both of them were kneeling as if in supplication. Both of them were fully naked, except for necklaces they had on. The male figure, his penis hard and protruded. The female figure, her breast hard and protruded, the hollow of her vagina sharpened. Yet, the immensity of their gaze denied a mere explication of the figures as sexual. What it depicted to me was the most primordial form of a lament, the human at its most atavistic, after offending the earth itself. I suppose that lament must be the ultimate form of transport. Is this why there is Ekwen Yawo, Ijala, and Shango Pipe? All lamentation must therefore grapple with the idea of borders, of crossings. Mine was a crossing from prince to traitor, and the staff in my hand was the very image of lament itself. Thus the journey continued. I carried the staff, and with each step I took, I struck the earth with it. I watched sometimes how the staff sunk into soft soil and scattered sand abroad every time I had to pull it out. The Ogboni continued to follow me, singing, chanting, "Pray, warn the young hunter, tread majestically, tread everywhere and upon everything, but when you get to the river, tread carefully, Ogidon lurks, always." I'll read from another section of the piece called Water. Let's see, I'm going to figure out the sharing. On an evening like this, many years ago, when I was still a boy, my grandmother, the Yauba, took me to the back of one of the houses in the palace and showed me an ibori dedicated to me. Have you wondered why, in all the sculptures you have seen, the heads of the figures are always significantly larger than the whole body? It is not because the artist does not understand proportion, or that the artist doesn't see the discrepancy between the sizes of the body parts in his work. In art, what matters to the artist is what they give prominence to. Look at this array, the maternity bowl. Do you notice how the eyes are big and the heads are big? Let me teach you a lesson in looking, and therefore a lesson in appreciation of the work of the carver. You see, the carver begins by taking stock of the spiritual consequence of the task at hand. Look at the maternity bowl again. Do you see? There are many sculptures like this with figures holding containers. Sometimes it is for basic things like offering kola nuts to guests. Sometimes it is to hold the divination knots of Ifa. But in this case, the function of the bowl is to carry necessary medicine for when a woman is about to give birth. This means that the sculpture will be used in precarious situations. Therefore, the base has to be sturdy enough and flat enough so that it doesn't stumble over easily. In size, it has to be large enough to be easily reachable, but small enough to be easily carried. Next is the posture of the woman. In our culture, the most sacred posture a human being can assume belongs to women. And when they genuflect, it is a reflection of the posture we take when we give birth. You must understand that this posture is very sacred and is held with the highest possible spiritual regard. So that when anyone dies an untimely death, people scream, "Ikunle abiyamo," and the moment of birth is invoked rather than the moment of death. Ideally, the posture wouldn't go all the way down like it does here, but the carver has to think of functionality, and the base wouldn't be as reliable if both legs are not folded together the way they are here. It therefore has to sacrifice accurate representation again for functionality. Remember, art that cannot perform its spiritual duty is useless. Yes, Iyalba, I said. Now, after making those decisions surrounding spiritual use and consequence, the carver will concern himself with the kind of figuration to be present in the array. Here, it is the woman, and she is in the situation where she is about to give birth. It is important to all carvers, especially when a sculpture carries spiritual significance, to clearly show the gender of the figures involved. This is why it appears as though there are many naked figures in our sculptures, but nakedness is nothing to be confused about. It is the default and perfect state of everyone. I will now read a part of my conclusion, which sort of explains what I mean by the village dialectic. For the village dialectic, it knows that language itself, its texture, sound, and rhythm, is also an intellectual disposition. This is why it recurses always to poetry and the poetics of language. The village dialectic thinks thoughts, but also has to perform them as poetry. Poetry is latent wisdom, and it knows that it must not only be intelligent, it must also be wise. It knows that intelligence will teach him about the world, but wisdom will teach him about life. It listens to elders, to those who have written books, to hunters, to rainmakers, to farmers. It listens to other village dialectics. And even if or when he disagrees, he knows that he must at least acknowledge. So he questions but does not disregard. The goal of the village dialectic is to advance towards the universal via the particular. Yet the particular is so particular that the village dialectic has to come to terms with the peculiarity of his own subjectivity and own it. To own his subjectivity, he recognizes speculation as the first step to witnessing, and speculations come alive as stories. In his world, whether fables, myths, legends, and so on are true or not is irrelevant. What matters is that all stories become totems, and it requires totems to guide him towards or away from destinations he has embarked upon. Thank you.
Hey, thank you to all of our readers. That was absolutely wonderful.